And now, Dr. Martha Nussbaum. She is the Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics, which is a dual appointment in the Philosophy Department and the Law School of the University of Chicago, where she has been since 1994. She holds 62 honorary degrees, many awards for her excellence in teaching, and she's written over 24 books. She was awarded the 2016 Kyoto Prize in Arts and Philosophy. It's an award meant to honor those who work in fields that are not recognized with Nobel Prizes, but whose contributions are no less significant to humankind. In 2017, she delivered the National Endowment for the Humanities Jefferson Lecture, which she entitled Powerlessness and the Politics of Blame. Dr. Nussbaum has written extensively and quite eloquently on the politics of emotion, but it is in this current work that her decency, her learnedness, and her position far, far above the fray, however successfully it may engage that fray, is further solidified as it speaks to our current political moment and the very emotional turn that these last 2 years have taken. Many a book on Donald Trump's candidacy, election, and presidency has graced the shelves of this bookstore and many others, and many of them venture into these subjects from kind of a pop psychology perspective, but I have yet to see any book that takes recourse to the Nicomachean ethics. She writes in a preface most remarkable for its warmth and curious, alas, for a book on philosophy, but not for her books. There's an exuding sense of love and gratitude in the pages of it. Academics can be too detached from human realities to do good work about the texture of human life. That's a risk inherent in academic freedom and tenure, wonderful institutions that did not protect philosophers of most earlier eras. My own commitments and efforts have always led me to want to restore to philosophy the wide set of concerns that it had in the days of the Greeks and Romans, concern with the emotions and the struggle for flourishing lives in troubled times, with love and friendship, with the human lifespan, and with the hope for a just world. And she has done this beautifully, sublimely. I read a few days ago that while we bemoan the absence of women in so-called STEM subjects and seek in a number of ways to ameliorate that in the next generation, the representation of women in a field like microbiology is actually 20% higher than that of women in philosophy. About 33% of all graduate students in the field would be female. Dr. Nussbaum is the woman philosopher of her generation in America, and it is exceedingly rare that any academic of her stature might choose to step out and make appearances in independent bookstores, particularly those not in their own city. As an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, a Martha Nussbaum lecture was an event. And it feels much the same tonight as everyone's presence, standing and sitting, attest to. I am thrilled that we were able to last welcome her in 2010 for From Disgust to Humanity, and those ideas have been further developed in this present work. We are so, so honored to be able to welcome her again. Welcome, Dr. Nussbaum.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Can everyone hear me fine? Do we need more volume? Okay. Thank you so much. That was just so sweet and lovely. And it's just so thrilling to be here in a bookstore where everyone cares about ideas. It's really, I mean, of course I would go to a bookstore. That's where I would want to go. And this is, I was just saying, the only one that rivals this in terms of the atmosphere is the seminary co-op on our campus. But I think this one is even reaching a much broader public, and that is truly great. So I'm going to talk a little about how I came to write the book and then some of the central ideas in it, and look forward to hearing your questions. So election night 2016 was bright daylight for me in Kyoto, where I had just arrived for an award ceremony after a joyful send-off from my colleagues at home. I was feeling pretty anxious about the bitterly divided electorate, and yet reasonably confident that appeals to fear and anger would be repudiated, although there would be a lot of difficult work ahead to bring Americans together. My Japanese hosts came in and out of my hotel room, explaining the schedule of the various ceremonial events. In the background of these conversations, but in the foreground of my mind, the election news kept coming in. producing first increasing alarm, and then finally both grief and a deeper fear for the country and its people and institutions. I was aware that my fear was not balanced or fair-minded, so I was part of the problem that I was worried about. By the time the election result was clear, I had to go out to have my first official meeting at the offices of the Inamori Foundation. So I dressed up in a cheerful suit, fixed my hair, and tried to express happiness and gratitude. I wanted to hug my friends, but they were far away. So that late that night, the combination of political anxiety and jet lag made sleep somewhat intermittent. So I began thinking, deciding around midnight that my previous work on emotions hadn't really gone deep enough. As I examined my own fear, it gradually dawned on me that fear was the underlying issue, a nebulous and multiform fear suffusing American society. I got a few ideas, tentative but promising maybe, about how fear is connected to and renders toxic other problematic emotions such as anger, disgust, and envy. I almost never work in the middle of the night. I sleep soundly, and usually my ideas come to me just sitting in my office at the computer. But jet lag and a national crisis have a way of changing habit. And in this case, I had a sense of discovery, so I went back to sleep with at least a little hope, or at least something to think about, and I set myself to write this book. There is a lot of fear around in America today, and this fear is often mingled with anger, blame, and envy. Fear all too often blocks rational deliberation, poisons hope, and impedes constructive cooperation for a better future. What is today's fear about? Many Americans feel themselves powerless, out of control of their own lives. They fear for their own future and that of their loved ones. They fear that the American dream, that hope that your children will flourish and do even better than you have done, has died, and that everything is slipping away from them. These feelings have their basis in real problems, among others, income stagnation in the lower middle class, alarming declines in health and longevity of members of this group, automation, outsourcing, and the escalating costs of higher education at the very time that a college degree is increasingly required for good employment. But real problems are difficult to solve, and their solution takes long, hard study and cooperative work toward an uncertain future. It's all too easy to convert that sense of panic and helplessness into blame of outsider groups such as immigrants, racial minorities, and women. They have taken our jobs. They are infesting our country. Fear, then, leads to an aggressive othering strategy rather than to useful analysis. At the same time, fear also runs rampant among people on the left who seek greater economic equality and the vigorous protection of hard-won rights for women and minorities. And of course, these are laudable and urgently important goals. But it doesn't help to react as if the end of the world is at hand. Once again, it's not that the problems aren't real and important, but fear all too often leads to aggressive othering rather than dialogue. Rather than analyze matters soberly and listen to the other side, my students all too often demonize an entire half of the American electorate. As in the book of Revelation, these are the last days, and a righteous remnant must contend against satanic forces. We all need first to take a deep breath and recall our own history. When I was a little girl, African Americans were being lynched in the South. Communists were losing their jobs. Women were just beginning to enter prestigious universities and the workforce. And sexual harassment was a ubiquitous offense that had not even a name yet and no laws to deter it. Jews could not win partnerships in major American law firms. Gays and lesbians, criminals under law, were almost always in the closet. People with disabilities had no rights to public space and public education. Transgender was a category that as yet had no name. America was far from beautiful. These facts tell us two things my students need to know and I need to make myself remember. First, the America for which they're nostalgic never existed, not fully. It was a work in progress, a set of dynamic aspirations put in motion by tough work, cooperation, hope, and solidarity over a very long period of time. A just and inclusive America never was and is not yet a fully achieved reality. Second, this present moment may seem like a backsliding from our march toward human equality, but it isn't the apocalypse, and it's actually a time when hope and work can accomplish a lot. On both left and right, panic doesn't just exaggerate our dangers, it also makes our moment more dangerous than it otherwise would be. It's like a bad marriage in which fear, suspicion, and blame displace discussion of what the real problems are and how to resolve them. Instead, those emotions taking over become their own problem and prevent constructive listening and cooperation. We all remember FDR's statement, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." We recently heard departing President Obama say, "Democracy can buckle when we give in to fear." Now, Roosevelt was wrong if we take his words literally. Although we had reason to fear fear, we certainly had many other things to fear in his time, such as Nazism, hunger, and social conflict. Fear of these evils was rational. And to that extent, we shouldn't just fear our fear, though we should always examine it. But Obama's more precise and modest statement is surely right. Giving way to fear, which means drifting with its currents, refusing skeptical examination, is surely dangerous. We need to think hard about fear and where fear is leading us. But you might not be convinced so far that fear is really a deep problem for democratic self-government. So let me then imagine a little dialogue between me, I'll call myself M, and a defender of fear, whom I'll call D, although it's really channeling the skeptical voice of the friend and sometime co-author to whom the book is dedicated. Okay, so D says, "But surely we don't want to extinguish fear. Without fear, we'd all be dead. Fear is useful, propelling us into life-saving action." M, "Of course, you're right there, but fear has a strong tendency to get ahead of us, propelling us into selfish, heedless, and antisocial actions. I'll try to show you that this tendency comes from its evolutionary history and its psychological structure. More than other emotions, fear needs careful scrutiny if it is not to turn poisonous." So then D says, "I'll need to be convinced, but I also want to know right now why you say that fear is particularly dangerous to democratic self-government. Surely democracies are often well advised to consult fear in thinking of how to construct laws and institutions. Isn't our defense establishment a sensible response to a legitimate fear of foreign domination? And what about our Constitution? Weren't the framers guided by fear when they wrote the Bill of Rights? After all, they wrote down all the things that the British had violated or taken from them. Their fear that similar things would happen in the new nation gave good, not bad, guidance to democracy." M, "It would be stupid to deny that fear often gives good guidance, but your examples involve fear filtered by careful and extended public deliberation. You've omitted hasty and ill-justified military strategies. You've omitted cases where rights were unequally bestowed or privileges hastily curtailed as a result of popular fear. We have a habit of scapegoating unpopular people in times of national stress and abridging their rights. Eugene Debs was thrown in jail for peaceful speeches opposing U.S. involvement in World War I. Later, loyal and peaceful Japanese Americans were interned in camps. These are cases where fear not only did not lead in the direction of rights, but actually abridged rights that were established. And the same climate of fear prevented even our courts from seeing this at the time. And just think, Korematsu was never overruled until like last week. Fear has a way of running ahead of careful thought. Fear of that sort undermines fraternity, poisons cooperation, and makes us do things we're ashamed of later. D says, well, once again, I await your arguments. You've persuaded me that there's a problem, but I don't see how large it is. But here's another thing. You use this title, The Monarchy of Fear, and you keep saying that fear poses a special problem for democratic self-government. What I don't get is the particular connection you want to draw between fear and a threat to democracy. To the extent that fear is a problem, doesn't it threaten all forms of government equally? M says, actually, no. In an absolute monarchy, the monarch, of course, can't be excessively fearful, but monarchs feed on fear from below. Fear of the monarch's punishment ensures compliance, and fear of outside threats ensures voluntary servitude. Fearful people want protection and care. They turn to a strong, absolute ruler in search of that care. In a democracy, by contrast, we need to look one another in the face as equals, and this means that a horizontal trust must connect citizens. Trust is not just reliance. Slaves can rely on a master's brutal treatment, but of course they don't trust the master. Trust means being willing to be exposed to allow your own future to lie in the hands of your fellow citizens. Absolute monarchs don't want or need trust. Think about a marriage. In an old-style marriage in which the male head of the household was like a monarch, there wasn't any need for trust. Spouse and children just had to obey. But the marriages to which people typically aspire today are more balanced, requiring reciprocity and trust on both sides. And trust is undermined by fear. To the extent that I see you as a threat to my well-being and my goals, I got to protect myself against you, and I will strategize, even dissemble, rather than trusting. So too in politics. That refusal of trust is happening all over the country now. My students don't trust any other student who voted for Trump, and they view such people as like a hostile force invading our university. Many Trump supporters return the compliment, seeing students and universities as subversive enemies of real people. And here's another side to the connection. When people feel fearful, they grasp after control. They can't stand to wait to see how things play out. They need to make other people do what they want them to do. So, when they're not seeking a benign monarch to protect them, they're all too likely to behave monarchically themselves, trying to control others. In this way, too, fear erodes the reciprocity that's needed if democracies are to survive. And it leads onward to retributive anger, which divides when what is most needed is a constructive approach to an uncertain future. So D says, you mentioned anger. That makes me ask another question. Why this emphasis on fear? Aren't there many emotions that threaten democracy? What about anger, in fact? Shouldn't we worry about that emotion even more than about fear, given its aggressive tendencies? People also think that envy is a major threat to democracy, fomenting class conflict. Finally, there's been a lot written about the role of disgust in racism and homophobia and other forms of stigma and discrimination. Says, well, you're entirely right there. And the chapters of this book will indeed address these different emotions and their interconnections. But having worked for many years on each emotion more or less in isolation from the others, I've come to realize that my previous strategy obscured some very important causal relations among the emotions. I'll try to convince you that fear is primary, both genetically and causally, and that it's because of infection by fear that the three other emotions you named turn toxic and threaten democracy. Yes, sure, people strike back out of a sense of unfairness. But what is that exactly, and where does it come from? Why do people feel that way, and under what conditions does blame become politically toxic? These are the sorts of questions that we need to ask about each emotion, and I think they all lead back to fear. Dee says, but why all this fuss about emotions? Surely the big problems in American society are structural, and we all need structural solutions, which can be implemented through law, whether people like them or not. We don't have to wait for people to become better or more empathetic or more self-aware in order to fix the things that need fixing. Focusing on emotions could even distract us from the work that needs doing. I totally agree that structures and laws are crucial. I have views about those issues which emerge in the book. But laws can't be enacted or sustained without the hearts and minds of people. In a monarchy, that's not the case. All the monarch needs is enough fear to produce obedience. In a democracy, we need much more: love of the good, hope for the future, a determination to confront the corrosive forces of hatred, disgust, and rage, which are all, I claim, fed by fear. Well, Dee, of course, isn't satisfied, and he shouldn't be, since only assertions have been offered so far and not arguments or analysis. Still, Dee should by now have a general sense of where my argument is heading. And so then there's yet a further question that's more fundamental that Dee might have. Why should we turn to a philosopher at this time of crisis? What is philosophy, and how could it ever help us? Philosophy means many things in the many different historical traditions of the world. But for me, philosophy is not about authoritative pronouncements. That's kind of the monarchical kind of philosophy, which I don't like. It's not about one person claiming to be deeper than others or making allegedly wise assertions. It's about leading with Socrates the examined life, with humility about how little we really understand, with a commitment to arguments that are rigorous, reciprocal, and sincere, and with a willingness to listen to others as equal participants and to respond to what they offer. Philosophy in this Socratic conception does not compel or threaten or mock. It doesn't make bare assertions, but instead it sets up a structure of thought in which a conclusion follows from premises that the listener is free to dispute. Socrates questioned a lot of people in the Athenian democracy. He found that they all had the capacity for understanding and self-understanding. Plato dramatizes this in the Meno by showing Socrates questioning an illiterate and oppressed slave boy, and suitably questioned, the boy turns out to be able to come up with a geometrical proof of some great complexity. Philosophical questioning assumes this basic capacity, but it also shows that most of us neglect its cultivation. People, including Socrates finds military leaders and politicians, don't really sort out what they think, and they rush to action on the basis of hasty, frequently inconsistent ideas. In that way, philosophy invites dialogue, and it respects the listener. Unlike the overconfident politicians that Socrates questioned, the philosophical speaker is humble and exposed. His or her position is transparent and thus vulnerable to criticism. I say his or her because actually Socrates said he would like to question women if he ever got the chance, if only in the afterlife, and Plato really taught women in his school. Socrates was right to say that his method was closely linked to the goals of democratic self-government, in which each person's thought matters, and to insist that it made a valuable contribution, improving the quality of public deliberation. He said he was like a gadfly on the back of the democracy, which he described as a noble but sluggish horse. It needed the sting of philosophical questioning to wake it up and make it conduct its business better. So my book is not a book of public policy or economic analysis, Crucial though both of those disciplines are to solving our problems, it's more general and more introspective. It aims at a better understanding of some of the forces that move us, and to that extent, it offers some general directions for action, but understanding is its primary goal, and as is dialogue. Understanding is always practical, since without it, action is bound to be unfocused. Philosophers, of course, talk about many topics that are related to democracy. My own work has also discussed political institutions and laws, making general arguments about what basic entitlements or opportunities, what I call capabilities, all citizens ought to have in a decent society. But that isn't the primary focus of this book. The other half of my career has focused on the nature of the emotions and their role in the search for the good life. I've argued, drawing on psychology and psychoanalytic thought as well as on philosophy, that emotions have an important role to play in a decent political society. Emotions can destabilize a community and fragment it, or they can produce better cooperation and a more energetic striving toward justice. Emotions are not just hardwired from birth. They are shaped in countless ways by social contexts and social norms. That's good news, since it means that we have considerable room to shape the emotions of our own political culture. It's also bad news for the lazy and uninquisitive. It means that we need to inquire into the nature of fear, hatred, anger, disgust, hope, and love, thinking about how we might shape them so they will support democratic aspirations rather than eroding them. We can't avoid accountability by saying of our own hatred and fear, sorry, that's just how people are. No, there's nothing inevitable or natural about racial hatred, fear of immigrants, a passion to subordinate women, or disgust of the bodies of people with disabilities. We did this, all of us, and we can and must undo it. In short, we need to know ourselves and to take responsibility for ourselves. It's incumbent on a decent society to give attention to how, for example, group hatred can be minimized by social efforts and institutional design. Even such a straightforward policy choice as the choice to mainstream children with disabilities in so-called normal classrooms has evident consequences for patterns of fear and aggression. We need to study these issues, in this case and many others, and then, on the basis of what we understand, to choose the policies that produce hope, love, and cooperation, avoiding those that feed hatred and disgust. Sometimes we can only produce better behavior while hatred continues to fester beneath the surface. Sometimes, however, we can actually alter how people see one another and feel about one another, as mainstreaming kids with disabilities surely has done. It helps to start young. Philosophy doesn't dictate concrete policy choices because these must be contextual, the fruit of a partnership between philosophy, history, political science, economics, law, and sociology. But it gives us a sense of who we are, what problems lie in our path, and where we should be heading. And its methods, involving respect and reciprocity, also model some important aspects of where we should be going. I believe it's not too strange or too bold to link the philosophical approach to America's problems with the method of nonviolent political change as exemplified in the life and work of Martin Luther King, Jr., who actually figures largely in this book. Some approaches to political change are violent, angry, and contemptuous of the opponent. King insisted, by contrast, on an attitude to others that he called love, even when what he was doing was to make an extremely vigorous protest against unjust conditions. Still, he said, we must approach even our opponents, not with anger, but with love. He always immediately stressed that, of course, it wasn't romantic love and didn't even need to like the people. The love he demanded was a combination of respect for humanity with goodwill and hope. We treat people as people who will think and listen, who ultimately may join together with us in building something beautiful. Philosophy, as I practice it here, shares that project and that hope. Thanks.
Thank you. That's very inspiring. But what do we do about leaders who cynically manipulate fear? And I mean, they know what they're doing, and it works. They encourage the wrong things.
Yeah.
How do we deal with that?
No, I mean, first of all, you got to call them out. Aristotle wrote the rhetoric in order to give ordinary people the tools to dissect the manipulative use of rhetoric. And the historian Thucydides, whom I talk about in the book, he gives many terrible examples of the manipulative use of rhetoric to show people what bad things are in store if you listen to that. And in the book, for example, I systematically contrast our current president's way of manipulating fear with not a Democrat, right? I'm trying to be even-handed, with George W. Bush, who after 9/11, when everyone was, of course, terrified, he said, we are going after some individual criminals. We are not at war with Islam, and we do not demonize an entire religion or an entire people. And he even created an archive that exists to anthologize all his statements on that issue so that everyone would know that he said this and he said it repeatedly and so on. So I think, we need that kind of leader. But the first thing is when somebody does the other thing, call them out the way King called out Malcolm X. Malcolm X was a pretty popular guy for a while, and maybe King underrated him in some ways, but certainly his desire was to manipulate anger and to create violence. And King repeatedly said, no, that's confused. That's not what's really going to produce lasting change. And so then we got to get involved, and we've got to get into the activity of politics and do it ourselves in one way or another. In my city last Saturday, Father Flager, who's one of the great rhetoricians of hope and love. He's a white priest who works in the African-American community, and he's a great leader for anti-racism and anti-gun violence. There was this big demonstration where he shut down a major highway to protest against gun violence. And, he actually persuaded the mayor, who's a tough cookie, to go along with this and to say, yeah, this was a good thing to do, to draw attention to this issue. So, it was a celebration of unity and determination to confront this problem. So I think there's great power in leaders who appeal to love, faith, and work. And so we have to get behind them and then criticize the other ones and run for office,
Thank you.
Was it a form of fear that resulted in rural white America electing Donald Trump?
Well, of course, the election was so close and he lost the popular vote. So there were probably 100 things that produced the result. I think one of them is actually misogyny. And I have a whole chapter in the book on misogyny because I do think that a lot of the bad emotions, anger, envy, and disgust, crystallize and sort of get knotted up together in a lot of Americans' attitude toward female power. So, there are a lot of things, but I think that the problems of rural white Americans are real. They don't come from immigrants. They come from things like automation, outsourcing, and, as I said, the increased costs of higher education, because now to keep up your living standard, you need more education than you needed in previous years. So we got to solve those problems. And I think it was quite right for both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders to direct attention to that issue of higher education and cost. The questions of automation and outsourcing are much more delicate and difficult, and I think right now no one quite knows what to do about those. But anyway, these are the problems, and the problems are not immigrants, they're not women, and they are certainly not African Americans. But it's so easy to teach people that you can demonize a very powerless group and inflict pain on them. I say in the book that our earliest fairy tales have this structure. They depict people who are helpless and they have some real problem, and then they learn to pin it on some ugly villain. So Hansel and Gretel are hungry. Their parents have to work at menial jobs. They have no time to take care of the children. So the children go out into the woods to forage for food. And that's the problem. But then the story says, oh no, the real problem is not hunger and manual labor. The problem is a witch who lives in the woods, and she turns little children into gingerbread. So you push that witch into the oven, and the world is just fine. Now, so that's really what's happening in our politics all over the place. And people's emotions are easily led in that direction because it seems so simple to just build a wall or put immigrant children in detention and so on. And of course it doesn't solve any of the problems that white Americans are really worried about, but it makes people feel that kind of bogus satisfaction.
Yes, perhaps you got this in Martin Luther King's calling for respect, but it hasn't been a wounded sense of dignity that Trump really have tapped into that is part of the brew that's created this rage and envy?
Okay, I think that's fair, but there's two different ways of thinking about dignity. One way of thinking about dignity, it's a matter of relative status, and therefore it's a zero-sum game. If some people have the good things in life and you don't, then, I mean, this is where envy comes in, and I have a whole chapter on envy. Envy is a big part of the history of this country, and we can see from Hamilton and that brilliant analysis of Miranda's in the musical that everyone was hooked on relative status and they were fighting duels all the time. Hamilton wanted to actually do something and create something, but no, a lot of the other people just wanted to vie for relative status. So people are very easily led in that direction. But the thing to do about envy is to remember, number one, that we all have an inalienable human dignity that's equal, and everyone has it, and then to think, what would it actually be to extend that to all of us? What are the things that threaten, that make our life not worthy of the human dignity that we possess? So that would be constructive thinking about dignity, which I mean, it's basically what my capabilities approach that I've developed in other books does. But, you know, Trump is not calling on that. He's not thinking of us as equal bearers of an inalienable human dignity who ought, therefore, to have things like adequate education, adequate health care that would support the desire that we all have to live a life worthy of that dignity. He's calling on resentment and envy much more than on the real kind of dignity, I think.
Thank you. What about the role of utopia in our politics? Aren't Brexit and Make America Great Again in fact utopias of nostalgia that have been packaged out of the flip side of the fear you describe as bright, shiny beacons of hope? And hasn't this all been delivered to us through the utopia of the internet, which seems to deny fear, or if not fear, deny skepticism by promoting social media as a benign and benighted way of connecting people?
I think there is a very strong tendency, especially in America, toward utopian thinking, partly because of the Christian eschatology that so many people are brought up on. I mean, no accident that I mentioned the book of Revelation, right? And that is a particularly violent form of that eschatology, which says the righteous are going to destroy and they're going to bring down their enemies, quite different from the kind of Christianity that King invoked, which was peaceful and egalitarian. So, you know, there is this utopian thinking, and I think that myself, all utopian thinking is a recipe for disappointment and resentment and rage. It's true in the personal life, too, that if you go into a marriage expecting some kind of, you know, starry-eyed, expecting perfection, expecting a Prince Charming who will solve all your problems, this is a recipe for a very, very bad relationship. And I think it's true in America, too, that whenever, it can be on the left or on the right. Marxism was certainly very prone to utopian thinking, and the socialisms of the 60s and 70s, when I was growing up, they were utopian in a quite ridiculous way. And even some of the early phases of the feminist movement that would say things like, well, women will never be competitive and they'll never do anything bad to each other. And of course, all the time, exiling from the group people who didn't think like them and so on. So, I guess part of being, as I am, a liberal means being incrementalist and thinking, well, we want to get things to be better, but we don't expect perfection. That's why I gave that little narrative of the 1950s. And I think my students have a very short sense of history. They think about Obama, the era of Obama, as a golden age, which of course it wasn't, and he was detaining a lot of immigrants too. And our legal aid clinic was working long hours on the children in immigration detention under that administration. So nothing was perfect, but there were decent aspirations. And one could certainly think things were getting better. But the idea that America was perfect, that it was a post-racial society, for example, I mean, that was ridiculous. No, who could live in a major American city and think it's a post-racial society? So I think that there was a naivete about that utopianism. And the flip side of it is, indeed, this eschatology of the demons are upon us. And so if you've read the Left Behind novels, the novels that are so popular about the righteous remnant in the heartland who fight against the forces of cosmopolitanism on the coast and so on, it's the flip side of that, because they think, oh, well, the Trump forces are bearing down on us and we're the righteous remnant. So by not talking to them, by not allowing anyone who was in the Trump campaign to speak on our campus, and so that would just somehow purify us and make us able to remain on earth as a righteous remnant and fight off the demons. But that's not the way you solve problems, is to engage. And you engage, of course. I think Gandhi was unrealistic when he said he would sit down with Hitler and try to convert him by love. That's not, but you just engage with whoever is listening. You engage in a democracy with the electorate and with rational people here and there, and you just try to prevail. And that's much better than thinking that somehow last days are at hand.
Thank you.
I'm a graduate student in philosophy, so thanks for your work and for being a force for women in the field.
Where are you?
At Princeton.
So what are you doing here?
I'm from here. So.
Okay.
But I wanted to ask about the different reasons you might urge privileged people to temper their fear responses versus oppressed people. So I take it like probably the desire for connection and productive dialogue would be common to both, but there might be some distinctions.
Well, I think there are huge distinctions. And I think, look, oppressed people have legitimate grievances, and some of them are directed at structural features that may or may not be the responsibility of the particular rich people who happen to be around. But still, they have legitimate grievances. The rich people may or may not be complicit in bad things. But I guess what I would say, and this is something that Iris Marion Young, a great feminist who was at my university and with whom I worked and who unfortunately died prematurely, she said, well, the problem is that if you go on playing the blame game, that's bad for both sides. And so one thing neither one should waste time doing is to try to look backwards and say, oh, who's to blame for the pickle we're in? Better to just move forward and say, what are we going to do now? And to be willing to just get together and work with anyone who's willing to work in a spirit of trust and cooperation. Now, of course, let's talk about South Africa for a minute, because it's sometimes easier to talk about a different country. And I've written about Nelson Mandela quite a bit, and I talk about him in the book too. Now, of course, it was terribly asymmetrical. The rich people had fear of being displaced from their privilege, and then Mandela had to figure out how to allay that fear so that it wouldn't lead to violence. But the oppressed people had this incredibly long deferred just demand to be fully equal participants. Okay. And so it was quite understandable that the ANC wanted to do certain very retributivist things. They wanted to, say, get rid of the rugby team. Don't have that be the team. They wanted to punish the white people. But, Mandela saw that that was understandable. And it was even, and you could say, quite legitimate, if you wanted to put it that way. But in the end, it wasn't very productive if what you want is a future in which the two groups will be able to work together. So he had this amazing way of just going up to people and expressing a kind of forward-looking trust. So when he went through the streets in his presidential cortege, he got down from his car, went over to some white police recruits, and said, "In you, we repose our trust." And these young white, they expected him to say, "We hate you and you're terrible apartheid racist." And, but that expression of trust moved them so deeply and changed them so that later when he died, I heard one of them being interviewed and tears were rolling down his face and he recounted this tale because the expression of respect and trust and friendship had moved them so deeply. So I guess what I want to say is both they're asymmetrical to begin with, but going forward, the strategy of producing friendship and trust and cooperation has to link them in some way, as of course King did all the way through, and really did produce friendship and cooperation. So, but that's not going to mean letting go of the legitimate demand. Once again, King, he always said that vigorous and courageous protest was quite different from retributive anger. You never let go of the demand for justice. You put your body on the line and you're willing to die for that. And of course, he did die for that. But that's quite different from saying, "I hate you and I want to kill you." That's just doesn't help anything. So, those are just some thoughts. And I guess, there's no simple answer to how you deal with situations where people have this legitimate demand and it's very hard for them to express any kind of friendship or trust. And yet, you can see that it happens again and again under the right kind of leadership.
Thank you.
You mentioned in a previous response, you referred to your capabilities approach. I'm wondering in your book if you explore a potential relationship between fear and capability deprivation.
Well, actually, what I didn't want to do, I had 60,000 words, right? I didn't want to try to put too much in one book. And I have to tell you that the capabilities approach is typecast in a certain way as European social democracy, which is kind of a dirty word on the right. It really is. When Goodwin Liu was nominated for the Ninth Circuit, somebody wrote something saying he was a European-style social democrat, and Obama dropped him like a stone, didn't return his phone calls. And, Obama was always very cool to me because I think he thought, too far to the left, it will tarnish my name. And so he was my colleague, but you wouldn't have known that for any contact that I had with him. So I think I was viewed as sort of like Bill Ayers, although I'm actually quite different from Bill Ayers. I'm much more of a liberal. But anyway, so I think I didn't want the book to be swamped by the perception that it was linked inextricably to this normative view, which is a view of social democracy. So when I get to the chapter about hope, and I have this long list of practices of hope, I include normative theories of justice. And I say, here's mine, and here's what I think this could offer us. But I don't try to link the argument of the book to that. I'm rather humble, saying, you should study a lot of them. You should figure out the one that you want to stand for, because it is very European. Because it talks about a very comprehensive social safety net, comprehensive health care, elder care, and so on, which I all believe in. But I think Americans are not very receptive to that. So I think there is actually, and I do try to say at least this much, that there is, as Roosevelt also said, very strong link between a very firm social safety net and not having the kind of debilitating fear that can so easily spiral out of control into rage and blame. I absolutely believe that. I do think that capability deprivation breeds a kind of hunger for whatever. It breeds two things: envy and blame, and is very destabilizing. And the fear, of course, is the first thing, and then it spirals into envy of the people who have something and blame of the ones who put it out of reach for you. So I do believe that, but I didn't want to say, well, to accept the general argument about fear in this book, you have to accept that particular theory of justice. So, for whatever. I'll tell you one story. When I went, so in Not-for-Profit, my book on liberal education, I refer to theories of social justice. Now, we philosophers use that term as the name of a genus, of which John Rawls's theory is one species, Robert Nozick's libertarian theory is another species. But I went to Utah Valley University, and I found that the professor said to me, "Why do you use this term social justice? Because the students don't want to read the book. They think it means socialism." And so I was totally astounded by that. But then it kind of educated me, and I thought, well, since what I do in the capabilities approach really is a kind of social democracy, I better not, if I want people to read the book, and I really, really do want people on the right to read the book, I better not say, this is so closely tied to that particular theory.
Thank you.
Hi, as a former UChicago divinity student, thank you for coming to DC. So you say fear is primary. Is there anything other than fear that's primary, or are our hopes for compassion and love and hope only something we can transform ourselves toward?
Well, of course, there are different theories of infancy. What I say is that fear is around the minute a baby is born, before it's able to tell the difference between self and other, and therefore before it's capable of love or concern in any meaningful sense. And in that chapter, I draw quite a lot on Donald Winnicott to talk about how out of this primal fear, with sufficiently careful care, the child becomes gradually able to be capable of concern. But I do think that that's later. Now, what might be earlier is a kind of delight in the world and so on that enables it to see another object as benign and precious and so on. But no, I think fear is primary both in the genesis of each individual child and in terms of evolution, because it's linked to parts of the brain that are found even in reptiles. And that's not true of compassion. That's very few animals have compassion. You have to be capable of seeing things from the perspective of another creature. And so dolphins, apes, whales, probably, although it's very hard to do these tests on whales for obvious reasons. Elephants have compassion. But actually, Frans de Waal, I just have the proofs of his new book called, Mother's Last Kiss or something. It's about the compassion, once again, of animals. And so I do believe quite a few animals have compassion, dogs certainly. But anyway, fear, they all have, because they have to get away from the bad and move to what they want. So it's very primitive, and it is linked to a part of the brain that could bypass rational deliberation, although it need not. So that's the way in which I think it's particularly dangerous and likely to get out of hand.
As a student and teacher of mindfulness, I couldn't help but think about the power of this practice in both recognizing and contending with feelings of fear. And I wonder if you address this, and maybe also if you've come across other techniques that you've found that are similarly powerful.
My research assistant who helped me read the book, this is about mindfulness, she is a great devotee of mindfulness methods, and she tried to encourage me to include something about it in the book, but I felt I didn't know enough about it myself, and so I'll have to explore it and write something more. What I myself find is music, actually. I mean, I'm a very keen listener to music. I'm also an amateur singer, and I'm going to write. There's another book in the works, which is probably no one will read. There's going to be about opera called The Republic of Love, because it's about Mozart's operas and their connection to Enlightenment politics. I've just finished writing the program note to Mozart's Ida Mineo for Chicago Lyric Opera next year, and that is the anti-fear opera, because it's about a universe that's ruled by fear and is absolutely rigid. It's these threats will be fulfilled. The father will have to slay his child. And of course, Mozart is, through the Greeks, he's making a pointed criticism also of Judeo-Christian culture. And instead, love prevails. A voice just comes out of nowhere and says, no, you're not going to kill your child. Love will prevail. And Ilia and Idamante will marry, and they will rule. So, I mean, it's this really quite strange opera for Mozart, because it's very serious, but it is absolutely amazing depiction of the world of the Republic of Love taking over from the Monarchy of Fear. So I guess that's mine. And, Mozart to me is just so great, and singing it is even better. Although it happens that my voice is a dramatic soprano, so the parts that I end up singing are the bad ones, like the revenge people. But that's all right. You understand the other side better if you can do it from within your body, So sure. And running is another thing I do, which is very, I guess, connected to mindfulness in many ways. But thanks. And I think we should all think what our own alternatives are.
Thank you.